The 4th of July parade in Riverside, Pennsylvania, moved down Main Street under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Marching bands played Sousa. Fire trucks rolled by with sirens chirping. Kids scrambled for candy thrown from floats. It was 2019, and the town had been putting on this same parade for 73 years. Harold Winters sat in a folding chair at the curb, wearing his World War II veteran's cap with the 101st Airborne patch. He was 94 years old, thin as paper, held together by stubbornness and memories. His daughter Claire sat beside him, watching him more than the parade, worrying the way she'd worried for the past 5 years since her mother died. "You doing okay, Dad? You want some water?" Harold waved her off. "I'm fine." "Stop fussing." But he wasn't fine. The heat was oppressive, already 87 degrees at 10 in the morning, and Harold hadn't wanted to admit that sitting outside for 2 hours might be more than he could handle. Pride was a hell of a thing. He'd survived Normandy and Bastogne. He could handle a parade in his hometown. The parade continued. Boy Scout troops, the high school ROTC, politicians waving from convertibles. Then came the motorcycles, maybe 40 of them, riding in formation, American flags mounted on the back of each bike. The Patriot Guard Riders, a motorcycle club dedicated to honoring veterans and fallen soldiers. Harold straightened in his chair. He'd always loved motorcycles, had ridden a Harley himself until he was 86, and Claire had begged him to stop before he killed himself. He watched the bikers pass, their leather vests bearing patches of eagles and flags, and the words, "Standing for those who stood for us." One of the bikers, a man in his 50s with a gray beard and broad shoulders, saw Harold's cap. He raised his hand in a salute. Harold returned it, his hand steady despite his age. The biker nodded and rode on. That's when everything went sideways. Harold felt it first as dizziness. The world tilted. The sounds of the parade became distant, like he was underwater. He tried to say something to Claire, but his mouth wouldn't work right. The heat pressed down on him like a weight, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the blue sky spinning overhead. He collapsed out of his chair onto the hot pavement. Claire screamed. People around them jumped up. Someone yelled for a doctor. The parade stuttered to a halt as the crowd realized something was wrong. The motorcycles at the front of the formation heard the commotion and stopped, engines idling. The gray-bearded biker who'd saluted Harold turned his bike around. He dismounted and pushed through the crowd, moving with purpose. Behind him, the rest of the Patriot Guard did the same, 40 bikers abandoning the parade to see what was happening. Harold was on the ground, unconscious, his face gray. Claire was on her knees beside him, her hands shaking. "Dad! Dad, please wake up!" The gray-bearded biker knelt down. "Ma'am, I'm a paramedic. Let me help." He checked Harold's pulse and breathing, his movements efficient and calm. "He's alive." Pulse is weak but steady. Looks like heat exhaustion, maybe dehydration. "Has he got any medical conditions I should know about?" "Heart condition," Claire managed through tears. "He takes medication, but he insisted on coming to the parade. I should have made him stay home." "Hey, no blame. He wanted to be here." The biker looked up at the crowd. "Someone call 911. We need an ambulance." But it was 97 degrees now, and the ambulance was on the other side of town, dealing with another heat-related call. The dispatcher said it would be 20 minutes minimum, maybe longer, with parade traffic. The gray-bearded biker, his name was Steve Morrison, though everyone called him Doc, made a decision. "We can't wait 20 minutes in this heat. We need to cool him down now." He stood and addressed the other Patriot Guard members. "Brothers, sisters, we got a 101st Airborne vet down. This man jumped into Normandy. He deserves better than cooking on pavement waiting for an ambulance." Without hesitation, the bikers moved. They formed a circle around Harold, blocking the sun with their bodies. Then, one by one, they removed their leather jackets, the sacred vests they never took off, the patches they'd earned through years of service and brotherhood, and laid them on the hot pavement. They created a barrier between Harold and the scorching asphalt, a cushion, a bed of leather and patches and honor. Doc continued giving orders. "Someone get water. Someone get ice if you can find it. Someone get a blanket or towel we can wet down." The crowd responded. People ran to nearby shops. The hardware store donated bottles of water. The ice cream parlor brought out bags of ice. A woman from the crowd offered a beach towel. The bikers laid Harold on top of their jackets, on top of a bed made from patches that said POW/MIA, never forgotten, and in memory of our fallen, and we stand for those who stood for us. They elevated his feet. They put wet towels on his forehead and neck. They surrounded him like a wall, protecting him from the sun and the heat and the curious crowd. Claire knelt beside her father, holding his hand. One of the bikers, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, put her arm around Claire's shoulders. He's going to be okay. Doc knows what he's doing. Your dad's tough. 101st Airborne, right? Those boys don't give up easy. He's 94, Claire whispered. He shouldn't be out here. I should have stopped him. Ma'am, no disrespect, but you couldn't have stopped him if you tried. Men like your father, they don't quit. They show up. They honor their brothers. That's what he was doing here. Harold's eyes fluttered open. He looked confused, disoriented. What? What happened? You collapsed, Dad, Claire said, squeezing his hand, but you're okay. These people are helping you. Harold's gaze focused on the bikers surrounding him, on the leather jackets beneath him, on the patches and flags and memorial ribbons. I'm lying on your vests. Yes, sir, Doc said. Needed to get you off the hot pavement. Hope you don't mind. Harold's eyes filled with tears. You shouldn't. These are sacred. You don't take these off. You're more sacred, sir, Doc replied. Our patches honor the fallen and the veterans. You're a veteran who needs help, so we help. Simple as that. One of the younger bikers, a man in his 30s with a prosthetic leg visible below his jeans, knelt down. Sir, I'm Marine Corps, Iraq veteran. Lost my leg in Fallujah. When I came home, the Patriot Guard was at the airport to welcome me. Formed a line of flags so I didn't have to see the protesters. Made me feel like I mattered. He gestured to the vests beneath Harold. These patches represent service, sacrifice, brotherhood. You embody all of that. It's an honor to have you lying on our vests, an honor to help you. Harold couldn't speak, just lay there crying, while 40 bikers stood around him in the July heat, their sacred vests beneath him, their respect surrounding him. The ambulance finally arrived. The EMTs, who happened to know several of the Patriot Guard members, assessed Harold quickly. Blood pressure was low, body temperature elevated, but he was stable. They decided to transport him to the hospital for observation. As they loaded Harold onto the stretcher, Doc carefully gathered the leather vests and handed them back to their owners. Each biker took their vest reverently, checking it over not for damage, but to make sure it was worthy of having held a veteran. One biker, an older man in his 70s with white hair and faded tattoos, approached Claire. Ma'am, I'm Walt Henderson, Navy, Korea. Your father's a hero. What he did, what his generation did, that's why we have freedom, why we have parades, why we get to ride motorcycles on Independence Day. He pulled a patch from his vest, a 101st Airborne patch, worn and faded. This belonged to my brother. He served with the 101st, died in Korea. I've carried it for 67 years. I want your father to have it. Claire took the patch with shaking hands. I can't accept this. It's too important. That's exactly why your father should have it. He'll understand what it means. He'll know it's from one paratrooper's brother to another. Walt's voice cracked. My brother never made it home, never got the thanks he deserved. Your father did. Let me honor both of them by giving this to a man who made it back. Claire hugged the old sailor, both of them crying. Other bikers approached with their own tributes, challenge coins, commemorative pins, American flag patches, each one given with the same reverence, the same respect, the same acknowledgement that Harold Winters represented something worth honoring. Doc rode with Harold in the ambulance, off-duty but still responsible, still caring. At the hospital he stayed until Harold was settled in a room, vitals stabilized, color returning to his face. Harold grabbed Doc's hand before he could leave. Why did you do that? Put your vests on the ground for me? Those mean everything to you people. People? Doc smiled. Sir, we're not you people. We're Americans, like you. Veterans and veteran supporters. People who believe service matters. And you're right, these vests mean everything. But they don't mean anything if we're not willing to use them to honor the people they represent. You're what these patches are about. You and every other vet who gave part of their life for this country. I didn't do anything special, just did my job. You jumped out of airplanes into Nazi-occupied France. You fought through one of the coldest winters in European history at Bastogne. You came home and built a life and raised a family. You showed up today, at 94 years old, to honor your brothers who didn't make it back. Doc squeezed Harold's hand. That's everything, sir. That's what we're trying to protect. The memory, the sacrifice, the men like you who did their job and never asked for recognition. Harold cried again. He seemed to do nothing but cry anymore. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was knowing his time was short. Maybe it was finally, after 75 years, being told that what he'd done mattered. The story spread fast. Someone had filmed the bikers removing their vests and laying them on the ground, had captured Harold collapsing and the immediate response, had recorded the circle of protection, the water and ice, the reverence with which they'd treated a fallen veteran. The video went viral within hours, millions of views, thousands of comments from veterans and their families, all saying the same thing. This is what honor looks like. This is what respect means. This is why we serve. News outlets picked it up. Local at first, then regional, then national. By the time Harold was released from the hospital 2 days later, he was famous. CBS News wanted an interview. The American Legion had called. The mayor wanted to give him a commendation. Harold hated all of it. I just fainted at a parade. That's not news. But Claire understood what everyone else understood. Dad, it's not about you fainting. It's about what those bikers did, how they honored you. People need to see that. They need to be reminded that veterans matter. That service means something, that there are still people who give a damn. The Patriot Guard invited Harold and Claire to their monthly meeting. Harold didn't want to go, didn't want the fuss, but Claire convinced him. They drove to the American Legion Hall on a Wednesday evening and found it packed. Not just the 40 bikers from the parade, but members from other chapters, veterans from every branch and every war, families of the fallen, over 200 people, all there to meet Harold Winters. When he walked in, they stood and applauded, not politely but thunderously, a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Harold stood there in his 101st Airborne cap, overwhelmed, while 200 people told him without words that he mattered. Doc eventually got the room to quiet down. Mr. Winters, we wanted you here tonight because what happened at the parade. That's what we do. That's who we are. The Patriot Guard Riders exist to honor veterans, to shield the families of the fallen from protesters, to make sure no military funeral goes unattended. We stand for those who stood for us. He gestured to the crowd. These are your brothers and sisters. Some served in your war. Some served in wars you probably think of as recent. Some never served, but support those who did. But we're all here because we believe what you did 75 years ago still matters today, will always matter. Harold's voice shook when he spoke. I never expected this. Never thought anyone still remembered. Most of my unit's gone now. Most of the boys I jumped with are dead. I'm one of the last ones left. Which is exactly why we have to remember, said a woman in her 60s wearing a Navy veteran's cap, because soon there won't be anyone left who was there. Who saw what you saw? Who did what you did? The stories will fade unless we keep them alive, unless we honor the men who lived them. Another veteran, a young woman in her 20s, stepped forward. Mr. Winters, I'm Army, Afghanistan. 2 tours. I came home to a country that didn't always appreciate what we'd done. People protested, called us baby killers, even though that was your war's insult. Made me feel like I'd wasted my time. She smiled. Then I met the Patriot Guard. They rode with me to my grandfather's funeral. He was a World War II vet like you, Navy. They formed a flag line, stood between his grave and some protesters who wanted to make a scene. They gave my family peace. Let us grieve without hate. She paused. That's when I understood. Service connects us across generations. Your war, my war, different battles but the same commitment. The Patriot Guard honors that connection, makes sure none of us are forgotten. The evening continued. Veterans shared stories. Harold listened to tales from Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different wars, different enemies, but the same thread running through all of them. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had to. Near the end of the night, Doc presented Harold with a custom leather vest. Black leather with 101st Airborne patches on the shoulders, an American flag on the back, and across the top, embroidered in gold, Harold Winters, World War II veteran, Normandy, Bastogne, and American hero. "We made this for you," Doc said. "You're an honorary member of the Patriot Guard now. That means you're family. It means when you need something, you call. It means you don't face anything alone anymore." Harold held the vest with trembling hands. He'd worn a uniform 75 years ago, had earned medals and commendations, but this vest, given by people who'd chosen to honor him, felt more important than any official recognition. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just wear it. Let people see it. Let them ask you about it. And when they do, you tell them your story. You tell them about jumping into Normandy, about holding Bastogne, about the brothers you lost. You keep the memory alive." Harold wore the vest home, wore it the next day when he went to the grocery store, wore it to church on Sunday, and every time people stopped him, asked about the patches, asked about his service, asked him to tell them about the war, he told them. Told stories he hadn't shared in decades because no one had seemed interested. Told them about the boys he'd jumped with, most of whom hadn't made it to see liberation. Told them about the cold and the fear and the moments of grace that had kept them human in an inhuman situation. People listened, really listened, and Harold realized that Doc had been right. The stories mattered. The memories mattered. He mattered. The Patriot Guard invited Harold to ride with them to a military funeral. A Vietnam veteran, no family, dying alone in a VA hospital. The kind of funeral that would have been empty, except for the Patriot Guard made sure it wasn't. Harold rode in the support vehicle, too old for a motorcycle now, but present nonetheless. He watched as 50 bikers formed a flag line outside the cemetery, watched as they stood at attention while a man with no family was laid to rest with full military honors, watched as taps played and grown men cried for a brother they'd never met. After the service, Harold approached Doc. That man, he had no one. He had us. He had you. He had everyone who served, and everyone who remembers that service matters. Doc looked at the grave. That's why we do this. So no veteran is forgotten. So no funeral goes unattended. So no family grieves alone. How do you find them? The ones with no family? We work with the VA, with funeral homes. They let us know when there's a veteran who's going to be buried alone, and we show up. Sometimes it's 5 of us, sometimes 50, but we show up every time. Harold started riding with them regularly. Every funeral, every memorial service, every parade and ceremony and occasion where veterans gathered. He became a fixture in his Patriot Guard vest, this 94-year-old man who'd survived the worst war in human history and now spent his remaining time honoring those who'd followed in his footsteps. Students from the local high school invited him to speak at an assembly on Veterans Day. Harold had never been a public speaker, had spent 75 years deflecting questions about the war, but he accepted. Standing in front of 300 teenagers wearing his Patriot Guard vest, he told his story. He told them about being 19 and terrified, about jumping out of a plane at midnight into enemy territory, about watching friends die and having to keep moving because stopping meant dying too, about Bastogne and the cold and the German artillery that never seemed to stop. He told them about coming home and trying to forget, about building a life and raising a family and never talking about the war because who wanted to hear about death and fear and loss, about spending 70 years thinking no one cared what he'd done. But I was wrong, Harold said, his voice carrying through the silent auditorium. People do care. The Patriot Guard showed me that. They took their sacred vests they'd earned through their own service and sacrifice, and they laid them on the ground for me. For an old man who fainted at a parade. They did it because they believe what I did matters, because they believe all service matters. He looked at the teenagers. Some of you will serve. Some won't. That's okay. Not everyone's called to military service, but everyone's called to remember, to honor, to make sure the people who sacrificed for this country aren't forgotten. That's what the Patriot Guard does. That's what I'm trying to do in whatever time I have left. Keep the memory alive. The students gave him a standing ovation. Several approached him afterward with questions, with thanks, with stories about their own veteran family members. One girl, crying, told him her grandfather had been the 101st Airborne too, had died when she was 5, and she barely remembered him. What was his name? Harold asked. James Patterson. He was a sergeant. Harold's eyes widened. Jimmy Patterson? Are you serious? You knew him. Knew him? He saved my life at Bastogne. Pulled me into a foxhole when the artillery started. We spent 3 days in that hole together, sharing rations and trying not to freeze to death. Harold grabbed the girl's hands. Your grandfather was a hero, one of the bravest men I ever knew. I'm so sorry you didn't get more time with him. The girl sobbed. Harold hugged her while she cried for a grandfather she'd barely known, but who'd just become real to her through a 94-year-old man's memories. That became Harold's mission, connecting with families of fallen veterans, telling them stories about the men and women they'd lost, keeping the memories alive for people who'd been too young or too distant to know the people who'd served. The Patriot Guard helped him. They'd find families, children of Korean War vets, grandchildren of Vietnam veterans, great-grandchildren of World War II soldiers, and connect them with Harold. He'd meet with them, share what he knew, tell them about a father or grandfather or great-uncle who'd served. This is how we defeat death, Harold told Doc one afternoon. Not by living forever, but by being remembered. By having our stories told. By mattering to someone even after we're gone. That's why we ride, Doc said. That's why we show up at funerals. Why we form flag lines and stand at attention. We're telling the dead and their families, you mattered. You're remembered. You're not forgotten. On a cold November morning in 2021, 2 years after the parade incident, Harold Winters died peacefully in his sleep. He was 96. Claire found him in his bed, wearing his Patriot Guard vest, surrounded by the medals and patches and tokens of respect he'd collected in his final years. The funeral was planned for the following Saturday. Claire called Doc to let him know, expecting maybe a few Patriot Guard members to attend. Instead, 300 bikers showed up. They came from Pennsylvania, from neighboring states, from chapters across the entire region. They lined the route from the church to the cemetery. They formed a flag line so long it stretched for half a mile. They stood at attention in the November cold while Harold Winters, veteran of Normandy and Bastogne, honorary member of the Patriot Guard Riders, was laid to rest. Doc gave the eulogy. Harold Winters was 19 when he jumped into Normandy. He was 20 when he froze in a foxhole at Bastogne. He was 21 when the war ended, and he came home to try to be normal again. He spent 75 years being quiet about his service, being humble, deflecting praise, never asking for recognition. Doc's voice broke. Then he fainted at a parade, and we got to show him what he meant to us, what all veterans mean to us. We got to honor him while he was still alive to know he mattered. He looked at the crowd. Harold told me once that he was afraid of being forgotten, afraid that when the last World War II veteran died, the stories would die too. But they won't. Because we're going to keep telling them. We're going to keep honoring the sacrifice. We're going to make sure Harold Winters and every other veteran is remembered. Doc wiped his eyes. That's our promise. That's our mission. That's why we ride. The bikers raised their hands in salute as Harold was lowered into the ground. Taps played. The flag was folded. Claire received it with shaking hands while 300 motorcycle engines idled in tribute. After the service, people approached Claire with stories, students Harold had spoken to, families he'd helped connect with their veteran relatives, other World War II veterans who'd found community with Harold in his final years, each one thanking her for sharing her father, for letting him be part of something bigger. He was different after the parade, Claire told Doc, more alive, more present, like he'd been waiting his whole life to be told he mattered, and you finally told him. He always mattered, Doc said. We just helped him see it. Walt Henderson, the old Navy veteran who'd given Harold the 101st Airborne patch, approached Claire. He was 80 now, moving slowly, but his eyes were bright. Your father wore my brother's patch every day. I saw photos of him at events and ceremonies, and there it was, right on his vest. That meant everything to me. Meant my brother was still present, still honored, still remembered. He talked about your brother, Claire said, about how much that patch meant, how it connected him to other paratroopers, other soldiers, other families. That's what these vests do. They connect us, across time, across wars, across all the things that should divide us. We're all just veterans and families trying to honor the people who served. Walt touched the patch on his own vest, the empty space where his brother's patch had been. Your father filled that space with purpose, with memory, with honor. Thank you for letting him do that. The Patriot Guard established a memorial ride in Harold's name. Every 4th of July, they'd ride through Riverside, stopping at the spot where Harold had collapsed in 2019. They'd park their bikes, remove their vests, and lay them on the ground for 60 seconds of silence, honoring Harold, honoring all veterans. Remembering that service mattered. The first annual Harold Winters Memorial Ride drew 500 bikers. They came from across the country, all wearing patches, all carrying flags, all committed to the same mission, making sure veterans were never forgotten. Claire rode in the lead support vehicle, carrying her father's vest. At the ceremony, she presented it to the Patriot Guard to be permanently mounted in their headquarters. My father would want this to inspire others, to remind people why this matters, why you ride, why you honor the fallen. Doc accepted it with reverence. We'll take care of it, just like we tried to take care of him. The vest hung in the Patriot Guard headquarters for years. Every new member saw it. Every visitor asked about it, and every time, someone would tell the story of Harold Winters, of the parade, of the vests on the pavement, of an old soldier who'd spent 75 years thinking no one cared, only to learn in his final years that he mattered more than he'd ever known. The video of the bikers removing their vests continued to circulate. Every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, every 4th of July, someone would share it again. Millions of views, thousands of comments, all saying the same thing. This is how you honor service. This is how you show respect. This is what love of country looks like. And in living rooms and nursing homes and VA hospitals across America, aging veterans would watch that video and cry. Because they saw themselves in Harold Winters. They saw their own fear that they'd be forgotten, their own quiet pride in having served, their own desperate hope that what they'd done had mattered. The Patriot Guard's message was simple. It mattered. You matter. We remember. That was the gift they'd given Harold that July day in 2019. Not just medical care or protection from the heat, but the gift of being seen, of being valued, of knowing that his service and sacrifice would be remembered long after he was gone. And they kept that promise. Every ride, every funeral, every ceremony. They honored Harold Winters and every veteran like him. They told the stories. They kept the memories alive. They refused to let anyone be forgotten. Because somebody had to. And the Patriot Guard riders had decided it would be them. Years later, members of the Patriot Guard would still talk about Harold, about how he'd transformed from a quiet old man into a passionate advocate for veterans, about how he'd spent his final years connecting families with memories, telling stories, keeping the past alive. He gave us as much as we gave him, Doc said once during a meeting, maybe more. He reminded us why we do this, why it matters, why we can never stop. The tradition continued. The rides, the funerals, the flag lines, the ceremonies. The Patriot Guard kept showing up, kept honoring the fallen, kept protecting the families. And they did it wearing vests covered in patches that meant brotherhood and service and sacrifice. Vests they would remove without hesitation and lay on the ground for any veteran who needed them. Because that's what honor looked like. That's what respect meant. That's what love of country and love of veterans demanded. They stood for those who stood for them. They protected the memories. They refused to forget. And on every 4th of July, at the spot where Harold Winters had collapsed, 300 bikers would remove their vests and lay them on the ground, a bed of leather and patches in honor, a tribute to one man and all men, a promise kept and renewed. We remember, we honor, we stand. That was the message. That was the mission. That was the legacy of Harold Winters and every veteran who'd ever wondered if their service mattered. It did. It always would. And the Patriot Guard would make damn sure nobody ever forgot it.